The debate over critical race theory boiled over onto Capitol Hill yesterday as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the nation's first black defense secretary both testified before the House Armed Services Committee. Two Republican congressmen, including Michael Waltz, the first Green Beret ever to serve in Congress, pressed the military leaders about recent efforts to promote inclusion within the ranks, including teaching courses about race at military academies. Here are their responses.
We do not teach critical race theory. We don't embrace critical race theory, and I think that's a spurious conversation. And so we are focused on extremist behaviors.
On the issue of critical race theory, et cetera, I'll obviously have to get much smarter on whatever the theory is. But I do think it's important, actually, for those of us in uniform to be open-minded and be widely read. And the United States Military Academy is a university. And it is important that we train and we understand. And I want to understand white rage, and I'm white, and I want to understand it. So what is it that caused thousands of people to assault this building and try to overturn the Constitution of the United States of America? What caused that? I want to find that out. I want to maintain an open mind here, and I do want to analyze it. It's important that we understand that because our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Guardians, they come from the American people. So it is important that the leaders, now and in the future, do understand it. I've read Mao Zedong. I've read Karl Marx. I've read Lenin. That doesn't make me a communist. So what is wrong with understanding, having some situational understanding about the country for which we are here to defend? And I personally find it offensive that we are accusing the United States military, our general officers, our commissioned, non-commissioned officers, of being, quote, woke or something else because we're studying some theories that are out there. That was started at Harvard Law School years ago, and it proposed that there were laws in the United States, antebellum laws prior to the Civil War, that led to a power differential with African Americans that were 3/4 of a human being when this country was formed. And then we had a Civil War and Emancipation Proclamation to change it. And we brought it up to the Civil Rights Act in 1964. It took another 100 years to change that. So look, I do want to know. And I respect your service, and you and I are both Green Berets. But I want to know. And it matters to our military and the discipline and cohesion of this military.
Then we will no longer be immature like children. We won't be tossed and blown about by every wind of new teaching. We will not be influenced when people try to trick us with lies so clever that they sound like the truth. Instead, we will speak the truth in love, growing in every way more and more like Christ, who is the head of his body, the church. He makes the whole body fit together perfectly. As each part does its own special work, it helps the other parts grow so that the whole body is healthy and growing and full of love. Ephesians 4, verses 14 through 16, New Living Translation. Hi, everybody, and welcome to The Breathing Room, a space where people of color and faith can come together to have our lived experiences acknowledged, to witness each other's journey, and to take a collective deep breath. My name is Kevin Holland. This is episode 9, and the title is Shooting the Messengers: What's Behind the Demonization of Colin Kaepernick, Black Lives Matter, and Critical Race Theory. Once again, I want to say thanks for listening in. I appreciate the support and love. The goal the Spirit put on my heart of all of this has been to have a space where what we experience as people of color and faith in the United States and in American churches, that either we typically stuff and don't talk about or discuss in smaller circles, but is not acknowledged by our broader faith community, can be addressed. I was talking to a friend recently about an issue, and she said she walked away from that conversation feeling like she was crazy and asking herself literally, am I crazy? Am I the only one that sees this or feels this? Why does no one around me seem to think this is a big deal when I think it's a big deal? It's for those of us that have had that experience where we know something's happening, but because those in our circle don't sense it to the same degree, we walk away feeling off. In the next couple of episodes, which will end this first season, I want to address the assault on democracy that we've seen in the past several months that's unprecedented in at least my lifetime, and a plan for moving forward with positive action. Given all the ground that we've covered and all the acknowledgement that we've given, what can we do as a faith community? What can we do as individual Jesus followers to work toward a more equitable and just church community and broader community? But today I want to reflect on some experiences that I've had and some aha moments that occurred in 2020. Several years ago, I was having a conversation with the daughter of a devout NFL football fan. She was sharing how her dad had recently stopped watching games because of the upheaval caused by Colin Kaepernick's protest. Of course, many of us remember that in light of unarmed black people being killed, Colin Kaepernick, former quarterback for the San Francisco 49ers, began kneeling at the beginning of games rather than standing for the national anthem. He told people why he was doing it, but we saw an example of a pattern that I've seen reemerge in 2020 in a couple of areas. It's the demonizing, the categorizing, the misrepresenting, the disrespecting, the projecting, and the deflecting of what people are saying as a way of discounting their message. Colin Kaepernick was accused of disrespecting the flag. Though his actions were not disrespectful, though those that claimed to be patriotic did not support him expressing his First Amendment right to protest. Though even the gesture of kneeling is not a violent or aggressive one, the disgraced former twice impeached president, many in our country, and many of the owners had this incredible outrage and umbrage. He's disrespecting the flag. How dare he disrespect all those that have sacrificed? I remember how I felt about it. This faux rage, this faux offense. And I began to see a pattern. Psychologists point out that abusers often feign outrage when they are challenged by their accusers as a way of re-traumatizing and cowing their accusers and gaslighting them to make them feel like they're crazy. It was evil and wrong and afforded those that were falsely accusing Colin Kaepernick of disrespecting the flag the ability to ignore and minimize and dismiss what he was calling attention to, only to find out when it was unmasked in 2020 that he was right all along. In June 2020, NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell admitted that the NFL was wrong for ignoring its players of color. Sadly and infuriatingly, he did not give a direct apology and mention Colin Kaepernick by name, I think out of cowardice and arrogance. But still, the fact remains that for all the years preceding 2020, it was obvious that Colin Kaepernick was not disrespecting the flag. But the dominant culture feels very comfortable labeling anyone that's a truth teller that points out areas that they're in sin and they need to change by falsely labeling them, and then no matter what their actions show or what they say, refusing to listen. Something else that struck me in 2020 and really caught me off guard and opened my eyes to how deep this is when, after the murders of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, there was an upheaval, and rightly so, in society and in our churches and in my church. And I would have conversations about Christians. In fact, I remember having a conversation and sharing for a midweek with a particular sister church and having a discussion about Black Lives Matter. And I was encouraged by one person to say, make sure you say all lives matter and you don't say only that Black Lives Matter. And I remember in that moment realizing I can't do that. Everybody knows all lives matter, but all lives don't have a 400-year history of being marginalized and dehumanized and having racist terror and massacre and unfair incarceration and police brutality. And so I just couldn't in my spirit indulge white fragility, as though if you say it correctly, all of a sudden someone will get it. And what I've learned, just like where Jesus talked about, sowing the seed in their different soils, the issue isn't the quality of the seed, it's the quality of the soil. It's the quality of the heart. So really, it's not about how you say it. It's about the heart of someone to receive it. And if someone doesn't have the heart to receive it, doesn't matter how you say it. And what struck me was the level of indignation that many Christians had toward Black Lives Matter. Like there's outrage, there was energy, there was umbrage, there was offense. And it struck me that it was disproportionate. In other words, Black Lives Matter posed no immediate threat to them. So why were they reacting with such energy and anger? And I took note. I said, there's more energy against Black Lives Matter, the organization, than there is for Black Lives Matter. These people are more bothered by some of the things that Black Lives Matter teaches or stands for or does than they are about Black people that are unarmed being killed by police officers and citizens with no remorse and no accountability. And I'm like, why the disparity? Why is there so much anger for this and then sort of a nonchalant shrug about people of color not being valued? And I think it's a pattern. If I can attack the messenger, if I can find something wrong with the messenger, then I can justify ignoring the message and avoid the discomfort that I might have to deal with if I really look at the country that I live in and what my culture has done and what my race has done to other people of other races. Now, I'm not saying that's a conscious mental exercise that people go through, but I believe it's at the root. You can't be conditioned for hundreds of years to think white supremacy is normal and it be in your subconscious, and then all of a sudden claim that it doesn't affect you when issues like this come up. And with people I talked to, there wasn't this measured response. It wasn't, man, I admire the heroism. I admire the fact that Black Lives Matter stood up for Black life when I didn't hear anything from any of our churches standing up to advocate equality and racial justice. There wasn't an admiration for these people being the civil rights leaders of the 21st century like we look at and admire those of the 60s. There wasn't any mention of, man, look at the courage and moral integrity of these people. They've got more of a good Samaritan spirit than any of the Christians I know. They've laid their lives on the line. They get death threats. They have sacrificed in ways I don't know anybody has done. So why can't I admire that? And I heard about the criticism. They support LGBTQ rights and they want to dismantle the nuclear family and they're Marxist. And I'm like, really? Are they going to undermine the social structure of the United States of America and we're no longer going to have nuclear families and we're going to become Marxist? And shouldn't we as Christians be for human dignity and the rights of all people regardless of their ideology? Or do we only care about people that agree with our worldview or our orthopraxy or orthodoxy? For clarification's sake, Black Lives Matter is not a Christian organization, which means that they have certain tenets that they hold to that I don't practice or agree with personally. But one thing I know for sure is that they honor the Imago Dei, the image of God that is in every person. And they have a good Samaritan impulse, and I can learn a lot from them about loving my neighbor as myself. Also, for clarification's sake, Black Lives Matter is not anti-police. It is anti-police killing Black people with impunity. In fact, in a 2017 article entitled 10 Things You Should Know About Black Lives Matter, the author says Black Lives Matter is about love. Black Lives Matter started with a love letter. In 2012, 17-year-old unarmed Trayvon Martin was killed by George Zimmerman, a neighborhood watchman who felt Trayvon walking home after buying a pack of Skittles at a nearby service station was out of place in the middle-class area. Zimmerman was acquitted for all charges. Alicia Garza retells the experience. Trayvon could have been my brother. I immediately felt not only enraged, but a deep sense of grief. It was as if we had all been punched in the gut. Yet soon people shrugged as if to say, we knew he was never going to be convicted of killing a Black child. And what do you expect? Turning to Facebook, Alicia wrote a love letter to Black folks. We don't deserve to be killed with impunity. We need to love ourselves and fight for a world where Black lives matter. Black people, I love you. I love us. We matter. Our lives matter. In a matter of moments, fellow community organizer Patrice Cullors created the social media hashtag Black Lives Matter, and Opal Tomiti created the website and social media platforms that soon connected people across the country. Black Lives Matter was born, and the hashtag Black Lives Matter started spreading like wildfire. A year later, it went viral during the 2014 uprising in Ferguson, Missouri, when people took to the streets with a simple demand: stop killing us. I also find it interesting that the Black Lives Matter movement has been nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. In the quote from the committee, the Black Lives Matter movement has been nominated for the 2021 Nobel Peace Prize for the way its call for systemic change has spread around the world. Now, it seems to me, as venerated an organization as is the Nobel Committee, they don't nominate hate groups. They nominate groups or individuals that are peacemakers and lovers of mankind. And that's who these people are. And that's what I want to imitate. You know, there's a way to say I disagree with certain aspects of a group in terms of what they teach or what they practice, and still admire and uphold and uplift and validate Christ-like or the godly or the good things they're doing. It's interesting, you hear people that say they're pro-life, but they're not pro-all life. They're pro-life that they deem worthy of being protected. And they find a way to ignore when other life that they see as less valuable is being taken. Do you know of any group doing any good in the world that you agree with everything they do and everything everything they teach and every tenet they have? I know this. I pray to God to have the courage and strength of character and Christ-like, good Samaritan-like love for all people, especially marginalized and oppressed people, that those in Black Lives Matter have shown. And I pray God give me the courage of Colin Kaepernick, being willing to sacrifice a multi-million-dollar career in a sport that millions and millions of people dream to be able to play, and to be willing to take a stand, to be blackballed, to have your career taken away and be demonized and hated and mischaracterized, and still be willing to take a stand for what's right. I ask you, what's a more Christ-like spirit? Silent cowardice, smug indifference, or compassionate action? I challenge anyone to say who has more of a good Samaritan spirit when it comes to Black life, Black Lives Matter, or the capital C American Church. So I want to say I admire, want to imitate, want to be like Black Lives Matter. I thank God for them. The latest boogeyman is critical race theory. Most people have no idea what it is, but now people are up in arms saying that's going to ruin our country. People teaching critical race theory are going to teach our kids to hate our country. And once again, it's a way of shooting the messenger and ignoring the fact that our history's been inaccurate and that we've been taught a sanitized, false version of history that has glossed over the despicable evil that citizens of our country have done to citizens of color for centuries. We talked about it a few episodes ago, these heinous race massacres that happened in the late 19th and 20th centuries that so many of us hadn't heard about until last year. Why? Because of the mythology of America being a Christian nation and being colorblind. And so the desire to teach accurate history, to teach that the practice of intergenerational chattel slavery of African American people since 1619 did affect and was in the founding DNA of our nation, though it was ignored by the founding fathers in the founding documents, the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And people are simply saying, can we teach accurate history? We're not asking you to be inaccurate or to paint us in a better light. We're just saying be accurate. But there's a pushback to that. I remember someone saying, when you've had privilege and someone advocates for equality, it feels like oppression to you because it feels like taking something away from you, even though you should never have had the feeling of superiority in the first place. The audio that I played at the beginning of the podcast was of an interview with Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, and also Mark Milley, the United States Army General and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I had to include it because they expressed the attitude we should have toward critical race theory. I want you to take a few minutes to listen to this provocative interview done by Chris Hayes. He interviews Carol Anderson, who is a prolific author, and she's the chair of African American Studies at Emory University in Atlanta. It is the best discussion I have heard on this firestorm surrounding critical race theory and what's beneath it. I want you to especially pay attention to the percentage of African Americans that were registered to vote in 1940. It'll blow your mind.
If you do not have this historical context, it is hard to truly appreciate what we are seeing in front of our faces. But that history is largely not taught in schools. People don't hear about Reconstruction and all that it represented. People don't know that the state of South Carolina had a majority Black lower house of state legislature in 1868. That Mississippi had a Black senator in 1970. I mean, I heard about it. I was lucky enough to have great teachers. Thank you, Mr. Kagan. But even that, not a ton. And that brings us to the assault on history that Republicans are now pairing with their assault on voting rights. It's a kind of pincer movement, right? So they're digging in the archives for methods of voter suppression and targeted attacks on enfranchisement of Black and brown folks, an attempt to roll back multiracial democracy to stop it from becoming real, while also attacking the teaching of the history that would illuminate to people why that effort is so dangerous. Why it happened before and why it won last time and why it put us where we are now. And so state after state, Fox News and Republicans, conservatives have whipped up a moral panic about so-called critical race theory. More than 20 states have either introduced legislation to ban critical race theory or banned it altogether. Now, critical race theory is an actual doctrine, academic method started by a bunch of scholars of color in the 70s and 80s. It attempts to question some of the race-neutral assumptions about law and power and how they function, particularly in the U.S. I will tell you, I am not an expert at it. I've read some of it. Like any school of thought, there are critics in the field and between scholars within the field. I don't think it's the definitive word on race and the law or American history. But it's a very different thing than how the term has been applied by conservative activists. A few months ago, Chris Rufo, one of the conservative activists who's pursuing this moral panic, whipping up, gave the game away, tweeting, quote, "The goal is to have the public read something crazy in the newspaper and immediately think critical race theory. We have decodified the term and it will recodify it to annex the entire range of cultural constructions that are unpopular with Americans." Just pure cynicism. If you don't like it, then it's critical race theory. That's what he's saying. If you don't like it, if you don't want your white children being taught that, say, white terrorists murdered black people throughout the South in a successful campaign to end the experiment of multiracial democracy and replace it with authoritarian apartheid, well, then that's critical race theory. You see how that works? So now the Republicans are railing about free speech to basically make it impossible or even criminal to teach certain things in schools. But it's all part of the same story, right? They're running back to the old tactics from the past while making it harder at the same time for people to learn the truth about that past. These are two fronts in the same war. It's the oldest battle in this country. Are we going to be a democracy for everyone or not? Carol Anderson has devoted her life's work to this topic. She's the chair of African American Studies at Emory University, where she focuses on public policy, issues of race, justice, equality in the United States. She's also the author of several award-winning books, including One Person, No Vote, How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy. Her latest, just out this month, titled The Second, Race and Guns in a Fatally Unequal America, and she joins me now. Professor, some of this history I think I learned from your book on voting rights, or it was recalled to me. What do you see as a scholar of this when you hear Mitch McConnell say that phrase, well, it's already illegal against the law to discriminate voting on the basis of race?
What I hear is the folks at the Mississippi Convention of 1890, where they combined all of the different disfranchising mechanisms into one, and did so knowing that it was designed to remove black people from the rolls, but in a race-neutral way, so that they could stay under the radar of the 15th Amendment and get judicial approval for disfranchising large swaths of black people, but do so legally.
That history, which is that because of the presence of the 15th Amendment, the effort to roll back democracy in the South between 1870 and 1964, let's say, had to be undertaken with this bad faith, this excuse, to me is one of the most toxic, sort of legacies we have from that period, and also something that it's very hard to not see in a lot of places you look these days.
Absolutely, because one of the things to justify these new regulations, these new laws, these new constitutions, was to say we're going after election integrity. We're cleaning up corruption at the ballot box. So it was to use the excuse of massive rampant voter fraud in order to remove black people from the rolls, and to do so in a way that seemed legitimate. Who could be against anybody wanting election integrity? Who could be against anybody wanting to end corruption at the ballot box? And so to swaddle the killing of American democracy in the flag of democracy is what they did in 1890. And it's what we're seeing.
That point, the killing of American democracy, to me, this is the thing I can never escape. And as someone who spends a lot of time reading about Reconstruction and then its end and redemption, is that I don't think Americans learned that we actually tried to start doing this after the war. And it was controversial. It was fought tooth and nail. But when you look at the South Carolina lower house of the legislature being majority black, that hasn't been achieved anywhere in this country since. And it's what was the target of white supremacy in its aftermath. And that history that we tried it and it was defeated, that we moved backwards, that's the history I feel like Americans don't get taught.
Oh, absolutely. Instead, what they get taught is that horrible film, Birth of a Nation, that defines the South as being absolutely wild and unruly during Reconstruction, and that it took the Klan to come in and bring order. So it took violent white supremacists, violent white domestic terrorists in order to bring black folks under control, in order that the South should be a peaceful, bucolic land. And that becomes the narrative of Negro domination, Negro rule. And it is insidious and it is inaccurate.
It's also everywhere. I mean, even modern tech books, when they read about Andrew Johnson, or the radical Republicans. I mean, even modern textbooks. And this brings us to this big fight now, right? So, look, history is always going to be contested in every place in the world, right? It's not some fixed thing. It's always going to be contested. It's always going to be a subtext for political battles in the present. And debate is good. I don't think there's some final word on any of this, and I want to be clear about that. But I saw this picture. This is Loudoun County, Virginia. This is parents packed into a very packed, parent meeting about whether they're teaching critical race theory in the school and whether it should be banned. And when you see these fights happening in state after state, what goes through your mind as both an educator and a scholar of this history?
Is that what we're seeing is a battle to control the narrative in a way that allows bad policy to be based on bad history. So it is to ignore the role of slavery and Jim Crow in American history. It is to ignore what the genocidal removal of indigenous people has meant to American history. When you remove that history and then you have these cardboard cutouts of the founding fathers that don't treat them like human beings who are making decisions, good decisions and bad decisions, but instead are simply heroic, then what you have is that you're not able to explain how we got here, what we're dealing with. And it's what allows a Mitch McConnell to say, we don't need a Voting Rights Act because we can't discriminate on the basis of race. That is to ignore that it is on the basis of race that you get race-neutral language targeted at African Americans using the vestiges of slavery, using poverty, using wealthlessness. With the literacy test, it was using the systematic denial of education.
Donald Trump.
No,
I'm just saying.
What we ended up with in 1940, as the U.S. is getting ready to start the Second World War, is that only 3% of African Americans, age-eligible African Americans, were registered to vote in the United States. 3% using this race-neutral laws.
Carol Anderson, whose scholarship on this has informed my own thinking about it so much. Thank you so much for making time for us.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you for this.
So I just want to shine a light on this pattern, whether it's Colin Kaepernick or Black Lives Matter or critical race theory. Don't fall for that play in the playbook. Understand there's an instinct in people that wants to justify who they are and doesn't want to look at themselves or the country that they live in a different light. And so they'll find fault with the messenger, just like the teacher of the law did with Jesus in Luke 10, where Jesus tells them which one of the laws is the most important. But then in one passing statement that we often overlook, it says, but wanting to justify himself, he said, and who is my neighbor? And then Jesus proceeds to enlighten him and the rest of the world up until this day. That impulse to justify the dominant culture, to justify American racist practices, to justify and minimize and explain away that we as a society feel comfortable with. The time-tested method that works best is to demonize, marginalize, falsely accuse, disparage, disrespect, and therefore ignore the messengers because they're sharing a message we really don't want to hear, but we're not honest enough to say we don't want to hear it. So we figure out another way to dismiss it. That's the society we live in, and that's what's going on real time today in our country and in our churches. To quote the notorious B.I.G., and if you don't know, now you know. Thanks again for spending some time in the breathing room, a space where people of color and faith can come together to have our lived experiences acknowledged, to witness each other's journey, and to take a collective deep breath. Be sure to subscribe to The Breathing Room on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, or however you listen. And if you like this episode, don't forget to leave a rating and a review. To connect with us, follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram, or send us an email at thebreathingroompod@gmail.com. For The Breathing Room, I'm Kevin Holland, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode.